Welcome, everybody. I am Michael Rugel. I'm from the National Museum of American Jewish Military History. We tell the stories of Jews serving in the American military here, going back to colonial days up through the present. It's great to be here today with Robin Judd. Robin's the author of Between Two Worlds, Jewish War Brides After the Holocaust. Today's program is presented as part of our Alan S. Brown Scholar Series. Alan S. Brown proudly served his country for 23 years as a U.S. naval officer and was a decorated veteran of the Vietnam War. In memory of his dedication to community and education, we present talks from renowned scholars and authors working in the field of American Jewish military history. I did want to start off today by remembering a Jewish war bride, a Holocaust survivor, Hannah Deutsch, who we just lost last week. Hannah was born in Dusseldorf, shared the stories of her families that served in the German military in World War I. Talked with great pride about joining a organization of German Jewish war veterans as a child from German World War I Jewish veterans, and they're dedicated much of her life to advocating for veterans. She escaped from Germany in 1939 as part of the Kindertransport and went to England. So a little different than most of the couples featured in the story, in the book, whose stories emerged from the very end of the war in the DP camps, the displaced person camps. Hannah left via Kindertransport in 1939, went to England, where she became a nurse, served in the British Army, and there she met a Canadian soldier and married him, and eventually ended up in Canada and then the U.S., where she devoted her life to Holocaust education and to Veterans Affairs. She was a great friend to our museum. So we remember Hannah, all the great things she did, and may her memory be a blessing. We're already getting some questions about will this be recorded? We are recording this and should have it up available on our YouTube page in not too long. Here at the museum, one of the most important stories we tell are the stories about American Jewish soldiers who liberated concentration camps. And these are equally inspiring and horrifying stories. But the one part of these experiences I always like to discuss is the small ways that American Jewish soldiers tried to recreate Jewish community with survivors. And that might include something like saying Kaddish together, or just making sure the survivors knew that they were fellow Jews with them as they were liberated. The phrase "Ich bin ein Amerikaner Yid" is something that a repeated phrase that you'll hear. I'm an American Jew. But for most of these American Jewish soldiers, in the liberating camp experiences were brief. They were there for maybe a couple hours. And despite this brevity, these interactions with survivors in these camps had a tremendously powerful, lifelong impact on these soldiers who encountered the camps. For the American Jews who remained in Europe after the war and worked in the DP camps, the encounters were, of course, much longer, much more involved with the survivors. There were two exhibits here at the museum many years ago. One was called GIs Remember, and that was about concentration camp liberators, and then one, Rescue and Renewal, which also dealt with the DP camps. A guy named Mort Horvitz was the guest curator for both of those exhibits, and it was in going through Mort's work that I learned of marriages between American Jewish soldiers and Holocaust survivors, and of course, Mort's own marriage to Helena, what was the most prominent in those materials. But the story of Kurt and Gerda Weitzman-Klein's meeting is one that visitors to the museum love. And I was just having a discussion today about the great Sephardic musician Valeria Jagoda, and I was lucky enough to have met her, and she spoke when she was here. She spoke very proudly of having been the wife of an American Jewish soldier. So I was very excited to see the book Between Two Worlds, and as it really presents these stories, these marriages in a much more complete context. It includes the stories of British and Canadian military personnel as well as American, and it was great to learn more about these couples and the complexity of the relationship amidst the challenges they faced after the Holocaust. We will get to questions at the end, so please use the Q&A function. The chat is available as well, but if you want your question answered, please do submit it in the Q&A, and we will get to those questions at the end. Robin Judd is Associate Professor of History at The Ohio State University, where she teaches classes in Holocaust Studies, Jewish History, Immigration History, and the History of Leadership. She's the author of Between Two Worlds, Jewish War Brides After the Holocaust, which recently won 2 National Jewish Book Awards, and contested rituals, circumcision, kosher butchering, and the making of German Jewish political life, 1843 to 1933. Robin currently directs OSU History Department's Hoffman Leaders in Leadership in History Fellowship Program and is the immediate past president of the Association for Jewish Studies. She's a recipient of 7 teaching awards, and in recognition of her work in Holocaust studies, Governor DeWine appointed her to Ohio's Holocaust and Genocide Memorial and Education Commission in 2021. Robin, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you. I am just delighted to be here. I'm going to share my screen and hopefully everyone can be able to see it. Mike, if you can't see it, then send me a wave or send me a chat.
No, looks good.
Perfect. Excellent. Then we'll jump in. And I love that in your words, Michael, you mentioned Flory Yogoda. Of course, we have a picture here of her and her husband, Harry, at their wedding. And today we'll be talking about them, and we'll be speaking about a number of different couples. I want us to do 3 things today, and my sense is I'll speak for a little over 30 minutes or so, 35 minutes, and then we'll have some time for your questions, and I'll try to answer them. So 3 kind of parts of today's conversation. First, just a little bit of introduction and background for those of you who may not have thought about this topic before. Second, to ask the question, why study Jewish war brides? And then using the story of 2 couples, Flory and Harry, Sala and Abe, we'll kind of follow the arc from the moment of when the couples met to when they started their lives in the United States, Canada, or Britain, and what those lives look like. So what is a war bride? And here I certainly will position myself, right, from a scholar in the United States. The term war bride is a term that gets used most frequently in North America, in the United States and Canada, referring to a civilian abroad who marries a member of the military personnel who's serving abroad. One could be a male war bride, and indeed there's the very famous post-war film, I Was a Male War Bride, with Cary Grant. The term war bride is used less frequently in Britain, but in all 3 countries, there is this category of the civilians who meet and marry military personnel who are serving abroad. And the question becomes, who is in the supervisory role to determine when those marriages should take place? Who's responsible for caring for these individuals? How should these individuals immigrate to the US, Britain, or Canada? And in all 3 countries, in the First World War for the US, for Britain and Canada, and during the Second World War, at the end of the Second World War in US, Britain, and Canada, there's pretty clear war bride legislation. And we'll talk about this December 1945 war bride legislation that's passed here in the US. In general, the number of non-Jewish war brides was really significant. There are over 200,000, mostly women, but men and women who come to the United States as war brides at the end, during and at the end of the Second World War. And there are tens of thousands who go to England and to Canada. A very small number of those individuals were Jews. And so if the question is, how was it if there are 220-something thousand war brides? How is it that you became interested in the few thousand of them who were Jewish? The answer has to do with some of the photos that you see here. Most significantly, the picture right here in my upper left corner. This is a photograph that I always loved as a child. The most, I would say, strikingly, fabulously gorgeous woman, right in the patterned sweater, is that of my grandmother, who, when I was growing up, I knew that she had been a Jewish war bride. She and my father were survivors. My father was a child survivor. My grandmother also survived the war. And after the war, she married an American GI. She presented her story as unique. And growing up, I didn't really know any Jewish war brides or very few Jewish war brides. And I always envisioned that their story was a unique one, that it was exceptional. And while, of course, all stories are exceptional, that thinking began to shift a little bit when I started teaching the history of the Holocaust course at The Ohio State University. As someone who loves using memoirs, the very first year that I taught the history of the Holocaust, alongside teaching Primo Levi's Survival in Auschwitz, I taught Gerda Weissman Klein's All But My Life. It's a memoir where she ends with meeting Kurt Klein, the man that liberated her. I started to collect more and more memoirs that I'd want to use in my course. I read one of the first memoirs published by a Canadian female survivor in Canada, The Tulips Are Red. Leisha Rose meets her future husband in the lines of combat. Gina Turgal, one of the first female survivors to publish a memoir in Britain, writes I Light a Candle. And in that memoir, she describes meeting her husband after the liberation of Bergen-Belsen. The story continues. Seed of Sarah by Judith Magyar Isaacson, Lala's Story by Lala Fishman, and a wonderful clip television show that many of us who teach history of the Holocaust use when we talk about how American audiences learned about survivors and survivor experiences. The television show This Is Your Life that featured 3 survivors, 2 of whom were war brides. The first survivor that gets introduced in the show is this woman here, Hannah Kuhner. Hopefully you are able to hear that. So this is Hannah Kuhner, who was a war bride, and that is part of her story as well. So why then talk about Jewish war brides? Well, first, Jewish war brides and their spouses teach us a lot about what in the book I call the problem of survival in the aftermath of trauma. Not at all suggesting, of course, that survival was simply or only a problem, but rather we often think about liberation narratives and the history of the post-war period in romantic and glorious terms. And one of the things that the narratives about the Jewish war brides and their American, British, and Canadian spouses teach us is the very thorny trouble of survival. What does it mean to be a survivor in the aftermath of trauma? Stories about the Jewish war brides also help us think about the very uneven, prolonged, and sometimes unhappy experiences of reconstruction and recovery. Mike mentioned Gerda Weissman Klein earlier. She writes in her memoir and discusses in her testimony that she always thought that liberation would be a happy moment. And yet there were certain elements of liberation that were truly unhappy. And our stories about the Jewish war brides give us light into these narratives. The Jewish war brides teach us about the multiple post-war communities that Jewish war brides and their spouses could belong to. And very often, those war brides and their spouses talked about a sense of unbelonging. Indeed, that's why I called the book Between Two Worlds, because the war brides that I study often discuss bouncing between communities of other survivors and communities of military personnel and their non-Jewish spouses. One of the things that I really loved delving into with the book was the ways in which the stories of these men and women tell us larger stories about marriage during and after the Second World War, immigration during and after the Second World War, and citizenship during and after the Second World War. And so to bring that together, in the book, I focus on 5 moments. I look at liberation. How is it that these Jewish men and women, these survivors that I look at, experience liberation? I look at encounter. What happens and how is it that these men and women meet one another? I ask questions about courtship and marriage. Encounter may be one thing I ask, but how is it that in war-torn Europe and North Africa, they move from meeting one another to creating these courtships to marrying? I think about immigration. How is it that they come to the United States, to Britain, or to Canada? And then once they get here, what are their early lives like? Oh, and I should have said, because it's a big no-no when we teach to just have images and not to actually introduce them. This is a wonderful photo of the chaplain Isaac Rose. He's a Canadian chaplain. He marries Leisha Rose. They marry in Canada after they had met. And I love the Jeep with the Magen David. And in fact, part of the story of their meeting in the lines of combat have to do with her being a member of the resistance movement and meeting Isaac when he is on the road in his Jeep. So let me quickly introduce Flory and Sala, 2 of the couples that I'll be using during the next 15 to 20 minutes or so as we walk through briefly what those 5 moments look like. And we see the wedding photo of Flory and Harry that you saw at the very top of the slide deck. And we also see here a wonderful photograph of Sala and Abe Bonder, who eventually make their way to Montreal. And if any of you know Montreal and know the bookstore Bonder's Books, they create the bookstore Bonder's Books soon after they settle. So to get us first to encounter, let's say a little bit about Flory and Sala. And part of what I try to do in my book is in each chapter, begin the story of encounter or courtship and marriage or immigration or early life with 2 couples or 2 individuals who will give us a really big sense of the larger story. So rather than throw a lot of people and numbers and places at the reader in the very beginning, I start each chapter with a story. And throughout the book is that of Flory Kabia Yagoda, who begins her wartime experience in Zagreb, which was then part of Yugoslavia. When the Nazis occupy Yugoslavia or invade Yugoslavia, that's probably a better framing, she and her mother and stepfather separately evacuate to Split. They go from there to Corsola, which was an island in the sea that had 2 Italian internment camps. It was really there that Flory envisioned that she would be remaining for the rest of the war. But in 1943, she and her mother, her father was off the island at that time. She and her mother evacuate Corsola, pushed on by partisans as well as members of the British military personnel. Fearing the approaching Germans, they are evacuated to Bari. And Bari is still actually a war-torn area when they arrive. So she would not have argued that she experiences liberation immediately upon arrival in Bari, but slowly over her early settlement in Bari, she experiences her liberation. It will be in Bari that she'll eventually meet her future husband. And we have here an image of Florey in her younger years holding her accordion. And if anyone had the time to meet Florey or spend time with Florey, one had that opportunity to hear her play her music. And indeed, in her home, one could see the accordion in a very important sort of space and display. Here an image of Florey's wartime flight. And I should thank the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum for their permitting me to use the images of Florey. Sala Solarts has a different wartime journey, and part of the reason why I wanted to make sure to include her is that she offers a very important foil to someone like Florey. Indeed, when Florey gets evacuated to Bari, Sala is being moved from one camp to another. So Sala Solarts is born in a town outside of Warsaw. When the Germans invade Poland in 1939, she and her family flee to Warsaw and quickly find that Warsaw does not give them the protection that they had hoped for. She first is interned in the Warsaw Ghetto. Later, she is deported to another ghetto in Lublin. And from there, she begins being moved from one camp to the next, beginning with Madianik outside of Lublin. And she eventually is sent on a death march at the very end of the war. And it's there and then that she is liberated by the Soviets outside of Dresden, which was supposed to be where the death march was to end. They don't make it that far. And indeed, it's in Oschatz where she is liberated. It will be many months later that she will eventually meet her husband, Abe. So then, if we were to think about Florey and Sala and use them as a way to introduce stories of encounter, of courtship and marriage, of immigration, and of those early years, what would their stories look like? Well, one of the things that Sala's story and Florey's story tells us, and really what we see in many of the encounter narratives, is that often in the stories that the Jewish war brides and their spouses tell us, whether they tell us these stories in their testimonies, in their memoirs, in letters from that period, or in diaries, it's an encounter of marking a Jewish presence in a world that had been feared and assumed to be one day rid of Jews, or to use the language of the scholar Alon Confino, a world without Jews. Many of the narratives that I write about or thought about or studied were narratives and stories where individuals wanted to stamp a Jewish presence back on their meeting experiences. And Florey's story and Abe's story, Florey's story and Sala's story is a really wonderful example of that. Sala and Abe, like many couples, meet around the Jewish holidays. Some couples meet in synagogue services. Some couples meet in the DP camps when soldiers would go and visit the DPs during the Jewish holidays. And that's exactly how Sala and Abe meet. They meet in Rosh Hashanah of 1945. Some of the couples meet in worship services, let's say on a Friday night or on a Saturday morning. And indeed, for many of the couples that I study, part of the story that was so important was the involvement of the American military personnel in cleaning up the synagogues that had been ravaged and destroyed and damaged by the Nazis, helping to reopen these synagogues, and then meeting their future spouses in exactly these sites. Now, if any of you knew Florey and Harry Yagoda, you'd be thinking, well, how is their story placing a Jewish presence? They met in the battalion, the space where Florey was working. She was working in the supply depot and the military base, the British military base. How is that a Jewish story? Well, that's where the storytelling becomes so significant. In all of her testimonies and interviews and in written accounts, when they described how they met, Florey and Harry would tell how they met in the supply depot where Florey worked, that Harry had just arrived in Bari, and that he had seen this very beautiful young woman. There was a dance that was upcoming, and he wanted to go to the dance. He asked Florey if she could go. Florey was quite wary of this American soldier. She and many of the other female survivors with whom I spoke and who I studied talked about that wariness of military personnel, the concern about sexual abuse and sexual violence. And so Florey pushed him a little bit away and said, well, that she wasn't sure if she'd be able to go to a wedding, to a dance, that she would need her father's permission. And indeed, Harry then insisted that the two of them go to the Cabillo apartment, where lo and behold, soon after Rosh Hashanah, and on the table, he saw a machzor, the prayer book that contains the liturgy for the high holidays. And he had not expressed his Jewishness. Florey had been very reticent to reveal her Jewishness up until this moment. In her remembrance, her stepfather had really encouraged them not to reveal that they were Jewish in certain settings. And this was a very common part of the liberation experience. We can talk about this more. And in a mixture of hand signals and pointing, Harry asked whether they were Jews. And indeed, he revealed he was Jewish. They revealed they were Jewish. And they went to the dance, albeit with Florey's stepfather, and mother in tow. And so the encounters stories for me were encounters where there was a real interest in reintroducing the theme of Jewishness. It also, for me, raised really interesting questions about language. How was it that these people spoke to one another, engaged with one another when they first met? And that question would take me into and through the next part of the book, which asks questions about encounter and courtship, leading into courtship and marriage. And here we have an image of a DP camp that was in the same space as a former Nazi camp. And that was very common, and we can talk about that in the Q&A. So how was it Florey and Harry communicated, or Sala and Abe communicated? Well, in some stories of courtship and marriage, there's a real emphasis on the shared commonalities. Sala and Abe is a wonderful example of that. Abe grew up in a Yiddish-speaking home. He supposedly, when he met Sala, leaned over and immediately began speaking to her in Yiddish. They shared a Zionist hope for the creation of a Jewish state. Indeed, Sala had tried to immigrate to Palestine over the summer of 1945 and had been thwarted from doing so. She had tried to illegally immigrate, and so she had to go back to the DP camp in Hanover, where she had been living and then where she met Abe. Flory and Harry were different. Flory didn't have much English. She had very few words. Harry had very few other languages, and they had to develop their own language. They each had to learn words from one another's sort of lexicon. And much of the courtship narratives that I talk about in the book are stories where individuals tried to figure out ways to befriend and create relationships with one another when indeed they didn't have a shared language. Many of them are not in spaces where courtship could have been easy. In some cases, there is a pending threat of transfer or demobilization. Indeed, the Salah and Abe want to marry, or Abe certainly wants to marry Salah when he learns that he's going to be demobilized. And at the time, he is unable to marry her because there were very clear marriage laws that each of the allies had, that courtship would be dictated by the fraternization laws. And in the book, I talk about what the Americans, British, and Canadians sort of each set out in terms of when and in what contexts members of the military personnel could engage with civilians. Marriage took on a whole nother level of meaning. And the Allies all had policies regarding when members of the military personnel wanted to marry civilians abroad, how they could go about doing so, who would vet the marriage, how much of a wait time would be required until the marriage could take place, what kinds of paperwork were needed, who would officiate. Did the marriage need to take place on the base, or did it need to take place in the local county clerk's office or in a local courthouse? So there were all kinds of policies. In the case of Flory and Harry, he requests permission to marry her. Soon after he learned of his demobilization, he asks Flory if she is willing to marry him and move to the United States. She is, as long as he agrees that they will bring her mother and stepfather to the US. The Cabillo family recognizes that there absolutely is no way they can return back to Yugoslavia. So Harry requests permission from his commander. The commander vets the couple. The local chaplain interviews Flory and interviews Harry. They process his paperwork and her paperwork. There is the mandated lag time, and they are able to marry before he is demobilized. Salah and Abe have an entirely different story. They have a whirlwind courtship in September and October of 1945. Abe requests permission to marry Salah, and his chaplain rejects the request. At that time, the Canadian military did not permit the marriage of any civilian to a member of the Canadian military personnel on German soil. As the chaplain said to Abe at the time, you can't blame can't blame the military. There are all these Germans parading as Jewish survivors and trying to sneak into Canada. We need to make sure that none of these individuals sneak in. And so Salah, in many ways, she falls prey to that. And so Abe gets demobilized. They shift from one kind of category to another category. She now gets considered to be a war fiancé. Canada did not have very clear war fiancé policies. The United States by 1946 does, but it's really only in 46. Britain has a much clearer policy by 1945. And Flory and Harry were able to marry easily. Salah and Abe were not. Salah eventually sneaks illegally into Paris. Uh, Abe leaves Canada and goes to Paris to meet her. They marry there. They go to Palestine. They live in Palestine for a few years, and then they go to Canada. So the story of courtship and marriage is not a simple and linear one. I ask a lot of questions about immigration because the couples had to ask themselves questions about how they would immigrate to the US, Britain, and Canada. Beginning in the Second World War, the US allows for a sort of subvention for war brides, but it will only be after the Second World War, in December of 1945, that the US passes war bride legislation that allows for a category of immigration legislation that will circumvent already existing quotas. The United Kingdom and Canada already have that kind of immigration legislation. They both have war bride legislations. And Canada will have a war bride system that will allow for war brides to travel to Canada on war bride ships and for their papers to be processed by war bride bureaus. The United States will follow that system. And really, as early as the 1943, the American Red Cross becomes heavily involved in the immigration of war brides. Florey travels on a war bride ship. Her war bride immigration story looks like a lot of the stories that I studied, with a couple of exceptions. She first goes to one of the smallest war bride processing centers. She goes to Naples, where there is a war bride clearing center. It's not as large as those in England or France or later in Germany. But from Naples, she gets cleared. She has another health check, and she travels on a war bride ship with other war brides, with demobilized soldiers, and with several refugees and DPs. Salah's story is entirely different. She immigrates illegally to Paris by train. Once she marries Abe, they are able to travel by boat to Palestine, and then they travel by boat from Palestine to Canada, where at that point she is able to enter Canada as Abe's spouse. Salah and Abe, Harry and Florey also tell us about the early years of these couples. The couples arrive to the United States, to Britain and Canada during a period of housing shortages, which means that most of the war brides and their spouses that I study move into the homes of their spouses. So when Salah and Abe arrive in Canada from Palestine, they move into Abe's mother's home. When Florey and Harry arrive in New York, Florey arrives in New York and Harry and his family meet her there. They then take her to Youngstown, Ohio, where the family lived. So it was very unusual for the couples to be able to start off on their own. And much of the early years that I learn about are stories where they're trying to kind of make sense of their new lives, where they are unfamiliar with the language, with the culture. Even someone like, let's say, Florey, who had so many languages at her fingertips. She spoke Ladino. She didn't speak Yiddish. And Harry's family all spoke Yiddish and English. So acculturation is going to be part of the story for them. Two, I look at questions of medical maladies. Flore talked about some of the early kind of stomach diseases that she and other brides sometimes experienced. I ask questions about what kinds of clubs and institutions they joined. For Flore and Harry, when they moved to Washington, D.C., it's with a tremendous amount of excitement that they see sort of these large synagogues with spaces where children can run along outside. And in the case of Abe and Salah, right, one of the places that Salah spends a lot of time is the Jewish Public Library. So I become really interested in circling back to those early questions that I ask in an encounter and try to ask throughout the project, which has to do with the Jewish nature of the story itself. I see that it's at the 20-minute mark, so I'll stop there. And Mike, I will let you moderate the questions. And that gives us 15, 20 minutes for questions and answers.
Okay, sounds great. So first off, let me just say we are recording this, and we will send out a follow-up email to everyone who registered with a link to the recording as well as links to buy the book. We did get a couple questions here already about intermarriage. One from Robert Farkas. What about Jewish displaced persons who married non-Jewish American soldiers? Are there more of these? And then one from Catherine Moore. How many intermarried but remain Jewish and raise their children Jewish or in both faiths?
So it's a wonderful question about intermarriage, and it's something that I do talk about a little bit in the book. And I didn't go into this into detail because, of course, we have 30-something minutes together. But one of the ways in which commanders often vetted the couples was using their chaplains. And chaplains during the Second World War had an incredible amount of involvement in the vetting of whether or not a couple made what was called an appropriate spousal match. And that often meant, not always, but often meant that a Catholic chaplain might dissuade his Catholic soldier from marrying, let's say, a Protestant, or a Protestant chaplain might dissuade a Protestant soldier from marrying a Jew, and a Jewish chaplain might dissuade a Jewish soldier from marrying a Catholic or a Protestant. So again, it's not that intermarriage didn't happen. It absolutely did. But it's really later in the Korean War where chaplains begin to have less of a role in vetting the couples. So already, while we do see intermarriage, we don't necessarily see it to the same scale that we might see it in later years. In order to give the project some coherence, I began with the Jewish survivors. So that means that while I often do see chaplains complaining about their soldiers who might be interested in non-Jewish women, unless those non-Jewish women or men converted to Judaism, and that's something that I talk about in the book, and there are a number of people who do convert, but then it's not intermarriage. I don't follow that story through. So I never look to see, did that Jewish soldier marry that Catholic woman that he was interested in? Because what I really this project really was about Jewish survivors and their spouses. I do look at a couple of Jewish survivors who married non-Jewish soldiers, because again, that's where I begin my project. In some of those cases, they decide as families to raise their children as Jewish, and the narratives of Jewishness will become part of the character of their family. In other cases, the families never learned of their mother or grandmother's Jewishness until far, far later in the individual's life. And that follows sort of the arc that we often see in terms of how do survivors engage with their own pasts. Do they talk about it? Do they not talk about it? And in intermarried families where the Jewish survivors are very much in a non-Jewish world, it was even less likely that they would be talking about their Jewish pasts.
Miriam Isaacs, my parents married in a DP camp. They had a rabbinic marriage, but the official civil marriage came 2 years later for visa purposes. How typical was that? They were both survivors. He had been a Soviet soldier, so in a way, she was a war bride. Well, I guess
Yes.
let you answer the first part of that first, and then a whole nother subject that the book is not
Yeah,
about, the Soviet Jewish soldiers'
right.
experience. But that's
Yeah,
awesome.
so right, it's such a so maybe I'll flip it and be entirely forthcoming. I use a fair number of languages in this project. Traveled to 5, 6, 7 countries to do the work, but I don't have Russian. And so I don't look at the Soviet brides. That would be an entirely different kind of project, in part because the policies around marriage and migration look very, very different than what we have with the US, Britain, and Canada. So if the couple went from the DP camp back into the Soviet Union, then absolutely, then that would be considered a Soviet war bride couple. So one of the things that I talk about in the chapter that looks at marriage is the ways in which there were over time different forms of officiating, different kinds of ceremonies. So until the war ended, the marriages, with the exception of those that took place in the UK, really were supposed to be on the base, officiated by the chaplain, maybe the commander. As we move into 45, we see some shifts and variation, and much of that has to do with legal, with questions of sovereignty. So, is it a country where the United States recognizes the sovereignty of that country, in which case those marriages should be officiated in spaces outside of the base? So sometimes what we see are couples that will have a Jewish wedding at the base but also get married in the county courthouse, or they might get married in a synagogue, and then later get married at the base. What I found sort of most interesting and what seemed to most shape the experiences of the survivors that I looked at were those individuals who had civil weddings, either on the base or in local courthouses or civil registries. And when they come home, so when they go to Canada or when they come to the United States or they go to Britain, the families insist on there being a Jewish wedding, because if there isn't a Jewish wedding, then the marriage itself is not recognized, and any children that would come out of the marriage would not be considered legal, that they would. And so, and you mentioned the Horowitzes, right? That's a great example of a couple who almost immediately upon their arrival have a Jewish wedding. It's incredibly important to Mort's family that that wedding takes place, and indeed, Helena's ship is delayed, and so they actually had a whole wedding planned, and then they had to postpone it because she doesn't arrive in time for her own wedding, and so then they actually have to wait and have the wedding when she arrives.
Yeah, Miriam did follow up that her parents, so the father was a Russian soldier. They ended up going to Canada, not back to Soviet Union.
Yeah, so then it wouldn't fall under the war bride piece.
Question from Janet Silver about your sources. Did you use Army records, etc.?
Yes. So absolutely the etc. One of the things that I loved about this project was the variety of sources that I could use. So, chaplaincy records, all kinds of military records, uh, wedding announcements, wedding menus, photographs, letters, diaries. Um, yeah, it was really quite a range, and in fact, this is where there's sort of a thanks and a shout out, right, to you, Mike, and to the folks at the museum. It was when I really started this project that your office recommended to me that I put a classified ad.
Mm.
Um, and so I put a classified ad in a number of different magazines and journals, the Jewish war veterans, and Jewish newspapers in New York and in Miami. And so I heard from people, London, Paris, Tel Aviv. I mean, I heard from people all over the world, and was able to do interviews, gained access to family records, etc.
Patty Nyberg asks, do we have some kind of estimated number on Jewish war brides who married American troops?
So, my best estimate is around 4,000, but again, as you can kind of see with Sal and Abe, and granted that that's a Canadian example, it was very easy to circumvent the formal immigration as a war bride. And so I sort of look at the category more broadly. I I once sort of said it was less than that, and I got a very long message from a uh, daughter of a war bride, who the daughter is a mathematician, who sort of did this modeling for me and said, well, actually, if there are this many war brides in this many cities and this, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, it must be around this many thousand. So we're looking in the several thousand.
Couple questions about divorce. Did any of the marriages you track end in divorce? Do the differences in cultural experience and just a number, how many marriages ended in divorce?
So I tended to stop my study in the early 50s. And in that, I saw very few, but there were cases of divorce. There were more later, when the couple's children began college or kind of emerge into adulthood. Again, it was in the minority. Some of that has to do with the cultural landscape of the 50s and 60s in the US, Britain, Canada, where divorce itself wasn't as sort of common or as um, seen. It was sort of seen as perhaps as deviant, perhaps as lacking respectability. Uh, Also, too, we have to keep in mind that for many of these couples, uh, there's a way in which, unlike for some of the divorces that we see in the non-Jewish war bride couples, where the women would return to Britain or Ireland or Scotland or Australia or New Zealand in the 60s, 50s or 60s, it was really unlikely for women that they would want to go back to Poland or Germany or Hungary. So that too changes kind of the landscape for them. But certainly some couples divorced, but they were in the minority.
Hal Hennig asks about discrimination. Did the couples experience discrimination while in service overseas or when they entered the US or Canada?
Yeah, so it's a wonderful question, and part of the reason why I call it Between Two Worlds is because for the couples, there's this constant movement where they don't feel like they fully belong. And let's use Mort Horvitz for an example. I mean, he had really good German from growing up in Wisconsin. He had German. He was able to communicate in German and in Yiddish, and yet, right on his base, he was really wary about speaking in Yiddish or in German among, particularly in the early period of April, May, June of 1945, right? So absolutely, in that sense, he did. For someone like Helena or for many of the war brides, they're traveling with other war brides who don't speak their language, and they're living with those war brides. They don't get to choose and say, well, actually, I'd like to live with that Polish Jewish, I'd like to bunk with the Polish Jews who are traveling, on steerage. They're bunked with other war brides and war bride dependents. Infrequently do they share the languages. When they come to the US and Canada, in some cases, they're sort of looked down upon by their spouse's family. Many of these people didn't want their sons marrying abroad. Some of them even had girlfriends that they had left behind in the US and Canada, and the families had grown attached to them. So there was a lot of uneasiness in the stories that I tell.
Yeah, that discussion of languages leads to Meg Malone's question. What were the linguistic implications for children of these multilingual marriages? Were there patterns in how languages were carried on or lost in subsequent generations? Lori's a unique example as a champion of Ladino, but it certainly seems relevant to that question.
Yeah, it's a great question, and that Meg Malone must be a linguist. But yeah, I can't speak to the intergenerational nature of language beyond saying this, that in many of the couples that I looked at, despite the fact that language was so important to the story of their formation, whether it was like in the case of Sala and Abe, that they both shared Yiddish, or in the case of another couple, Clara and Danny Isaacman, who shared Yiddish, although his Yiddish was not as good as Abe's, or it was the case of someone like Flory and Harry, who don't have a language, and Flory kind of speaks with so much love about Ladino. Infrequently do they speak at home with that European language. It gets woven in other ways. And so like in Flory's case, right, the place of music in her family's tradition, in Sala and Abe belonging to the Jewish Public Library and the Workmen's Circle, in Danny and Clara's case, it's the kind of their Zionist activities and the use of Hebrew. So language will matter in all kinds of ways, but what I don't see is, the couple speaking Polish with their children or Yiddish with their children or Ladino with their children. In many times, English for them is a way to acculturate, and they're going to try as hard as they can to raise their children speaking English in the US, Britain, and Canada.
Okay, we are just about out of time, so let's get to one more. How about Joanna Sliwa? Was there anything that surprised you about your research and findings?
I think the first thing that surprised me, and thank you, Joanna, for the question. The first thing that absolutely surprised me was how many of these individuals there were. I went in with the expectation that I would be finding a handful, and instead, I then was kind of forced to think about how to write a book that was going to be readable and could appeal to a crossover audience without just throwing data at people. So that absolutely was a surprise. I also was surprised by the ways in which this was a strategy, that individuals talked about the war bride phenomenon as a way to immigrate to the US, Britain, and Canada. And that does not minimize the importance of these relationships, or in many cases became like decades long relationship. But very often they understood that marrying a member of the American, British, or Canadian military meant that one could leave Europe and go to the US, Britain, and Canada.
Okay, thank you. Thank you to everyone for being on today. Robin, do you want to finish up with any final words before we sign off?
No, I'm just so grateful to your audience and thank you and to the museum. And it's a wonderful place. I hope people take advantage of the museum in the DC area. So
Thank
thanks
you.
again.
Yeah, and so we will send out a follow-up email to everyone who registered with links to purchase the book as well as to the recording. Looks like everything working. Assuming the recording turns out the way we should have a email out to everyone shortly. So again, thank you for being on. Robin, thank you for being here. We really appreciate it.
Thanks so much. Have a great rest of your day.